On the podcast today, we have a guest named Jeff Lieberman, and this conversation was so phenomenal. I'm looking forward for you to hear from Jeff because he's an incredible person. I actually first heard of him through a TED Talk that he had. It was from 2011. It's on YouTube. It's called Science and Spirituality. So I had to have him on the podcast. So we finally connected, and this episode was amazing. But just a bit of background on Jeff before I share with you about the conversation we had. It says Jeff received 4 degrees at MIT in physics, math, mechanical engineering, and robotics. He hosted Time Warp on the Discovery Channel about the wonders of science and has made large-scale art for the last 15 years. And by external measures, he was incredibly successful, but inside something was missing. And that disconnect led him to be deeply depressed in high school and have a chronic pain for almost 20 years after that. We actually get into that a bit into his story at the beginning of this episode. But furthermore, he shares in his bio that he learned quantum mechanics before learning about his emotions. And he marvels the fact that we can measure the external universe in such degree, but most of us don't learn about our insides, our emotions, what leads to us flourishing, and how to take great care of ourselves. And that's why over the last 11 years, he's been focusing on personal and group development, facilitating students and adults through intensives, and speaking all around the world on topics of art, science, education, healing, and consciousness. So I think that his bio just describes so beautifully the conversation we had. And he has an awesome opportunity coming up. So if you're from the ages of 18 to 24, he's hosting a camp, a sleepaway camp, but he calls it Sleep Awake Camp, to journey and get to know yourself more and just learn different practices to help you in thriving. So you'll hear more about this in this episode, the Sleep Awake Camp. That was a major focus of this, but really it's about how we develop a deeper connection, authentic and thriving new normal for ourselves and of course for the world. So it's an incredible conversation. Hope you enjoy it and getting to know Jeff and his work, and look forward to talking with you soon and diving in soon. I'll see you in the episode. Welcome to the Science and Spirituality Podcast, where we dive deep into universal spiritual principles and ground them in modern science. My name is Chris Carden. And my name is Kevin Carden, and we are committed to simplifying the spiritual side of success for you with easy to understand scientific research so you can walk away with practical tools to create radical transformations in your life. Let's get started. All right. So welcome back to the Science and Spirituality Podcast. And we have a very special guest today, Jeff Lieberman. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation because just as before we recorded, I was sharing with you how much your TED Talk really impacted my life. And so really looking forward to hearing more from you and just getting to talk with you more on this podcast. So
yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's absolutely a pleasure. I'm excited to chat about all the connections.
Same. Yeah. So let's begin with just your story of, I've read a bit in your bio and everything, but like you went through like depression and all that. I think that's a common thing or a lot of people go through and not really even knowing like what that is or how, like what to do about it. Which is beautiful that there's a lot that has changed in the world in terms of support or resources. But anyway, I'd love to hear your story of like what got you to this place now where you're going to be running this camp for, kids.
Yeah, I guess that's the kind of container in which I'll tell the story. I'm making a summer camp that I wish existed when I was 20 years old, because it would have saved me from 10 to 15 years of heartache and depression. And I think the tools that I have found along the way that I can detail out, like, are things that once you are exposed to them are incredibly impactful, but no one's exposed to them. It took me years of just searching and Googling and reading to finally get exposed to tools that were transformative for my well-being. So go way back. First 6 years of my life was a lot of playing with Legos. Then I was really sure I was going to be a doctor. I really wanted to help people, but then I got like a toe surgery and I almost fainted and they had to give me smelling salts. And so I was like, okay, that's not my profession. There's too much blood going on here. How else am I going to help people? And I was always interested in other people, tracking other people and what do they mean when they say what they say and all this kind of stuff. But by the time I was 10 years old, that led to insomnia. At the end of every day, I'd be analyzing and ruminating, and I couldn't shut this thing off. And not that we should shut it off, but that was my attitude, was like, what is going wrong? And so then you get into the meta conversation. Why can't I stop thinking? Why can't I? And then of course, insomnia.
Yep.
So I started seeing psychologists at 10, didn't do much to the rumination. By the time I was about 15, on the one hand, I was competing in state math competitions. I was really excelled at math and science. It was just like very, very fun for me. I'd literally come home from school and make up new math problems to solve and figure out structures of the universe, which is, interestingly intertwined with the patterns of humans.
Right.
But on the other hand, I was depressed, and I had the kind of depression where it was like a weird meta depression. Like everything around me looked like it was fine.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt horrible. And that kind of like misalignment was really hard. I had that kind of like, almost like, I don't know if they call that survivor's guilt. Like I could look around and see all the suffering from so many other people's perspective of homelessness and all that stuff. I didn't have any of that. I was really privileged.
Yep.
So who am I to have all these problems and being stuck in the middle of depression, but literally, suicidal depression by the time I was 17 years old. And I had seen psychologists, and it was good to have someone to talk to, but it didn't actually get really to the core of what was going on.
Mm.
And, by the time I was 18, I was taking Prozac antidepressants, and that lasted for 2 years. And that made my body feel very odd, but symptomatically, it took away the worst kind of corners of that depression and just rounded things off. And I have a pretty nuanced belief around antidepressants and things like that we can get into later. And I do think they're really useful in order to put someone in a state where they can do the work of getting to the root of things. But I do not believe that, maybe in 1% of cases do they actually get to the root of something being a chemical imbalance. But
Sure.
In our culture right now, that's kind of the machine metaphor that we use for the body.
Right.
Oh, there's this chemical's low, add some chemical.
Yep.
Well, why is this chemical low? Well, because it was low in your parents. Well, why was it low in them? We just we tag these things really quickly. But then, when for example, now I look at the fact that 75% of my heritage is Jewish and has been oppressed people for 2,000 years. Well, there's probably reasons that we have chemical shifts in our body because of our behaviors that we've had to take on generation after generation. And then, you grow up in any family you grow up in, but then all of a sudden you just think of these people as mom and dad.
Yep.
But and once you get out in the real world, you realize, oh, no, these are just two other people that have their own stories and their own histories, and they're very unique. And so I didn't see that at all at the time, but deep depression. And I went to MIT for 10 years, and then I started hosting Time Warp on Discovery Channel. And I was very interested in these things, very passionate person, but this background kind of wave of depression and rumination just was always there. And, by the time Time Warp ended, I did Time Warp for 3 years, hosting a TV show. So it's like literally a lot of people's exact dream of what would make you happy, and so it was mine as well. I had a great job, by its description. I had a cool partner. I had a cool place to live. I was making good money, all this kind of stuff. And the irony of, mental health is that was the thing that made it the most stark that things weren't okay, and that nothing on the outside was actually going to make it okay.
Yep.
So in some sense, if you look at like Maslow's hierarchy, I had people recognizing me on the street. It was like, all this kind of stuff. And, you saw my TED talk and all this kind of people knew who I was, and everything on the outside was fine. And that was when the real crash happened. That was when that show ended and I wasn't busy anymore, which in some sense, a lot of our culture keeps ourselves really busy because we don't want to feel what would happen if we weren't busy.
Exactly.
Which is really sad to think about. But I finally got to this place where there was nowhere else that I knew to look to fill the hole that was going on inside. And I'm so thankful that happened now, but that was 2 years of really hard living. And I went from that place to the only thing I could think of doing besides like eating a lot of ice cream was to just read, and just to read about well-being. I was an academic oriented, intellectual person. And I was just like, and literally the place I am now is laughable. Like, I wouldn't meditate. It just seemed too woo-woo new age for me,
Yeah.
And so the first place I started was like neuroscientists talking about well-being, and some of them talking about, well, if you brain scan people and they meditate, they have deeper centers of compassion and gratitude, and they have higher well-being. Okay, well, I'll meditate then. It's
Sure.
scientifically
Yeah.
validated. This is kind of how stunted my openness was to what could be experienced. And now, one of my favorite things to do is talk to really scientifically minded people and challenge a lot of the presuppositions that mind makes about the nature of reality. It's really
Definitely.
fun because I lived in that side, in that world for a long time. So I was hopping probably 2 or 3 books a week for 2 years. It's the only thing I could think of doing. And I had enough money where I wasn't forced to go work on. So I was just like, okay, I'm going to figure this out. What is well-being? And unfortunately, when you look at most of the Western books, there's not a lot of insight that I found. I was looking a lot, and I was just like, this all feels superficial. This feels symptomatic still. I don't want a symptomatic shift. I don't want like a temporary thing. I want to really understand what's going on. And I really, once anyone starts doing any meditation, they see the level of insanity that's going on in them, in their own mind. Unless you're like 1 in a million people and you were raised by enlightened people and that sort of thing. But like, I've never met one of those people yet. You sit and you're just like, okay, I'm just going to sit and pay attention to my breath. No. Then the level of cacophony really comes forward and the microphone turns on. So that was revealing. And so I started doing that, did some meditation retreats, that sort of thing. And then by the time 2 years went by, I had hopped through 150 books or something like that. And I finally found this book. And I remember it like it was yesterday. I on Amazon, it's always like, if you read this, you might try these ones.
Right.
And this book, I Am That, came up. I don't know if you've ever been exposed to I Am That by Nisargadatta. He was a mystic in Bombay. He smoked cigarettes his whole life. He just had a cigarette store, and people just started sitting in his store to ask him questions because they could tell something was going on. And there's someone, an American, who just went there and started tape recording conversations and translating them. And when I read the Amazon review for this book, it said literally, like it said, you've been looking everywhere for a book that's going to get to the root of the understanding of reality. Buy this book, read it twice, and then put it away and put all your books away and do the experiments on reality that he recommends, and you'll come to understand the nature of reality.
Interesting.
And I just even reading that, I was in tears, because it's like, you're on the search for anything that gets beyond the level of discourse that's in our culture. I found that book, and for 5 years, I just read that book over and over. And I didn't just read it twice. My mind wouldn't let me do that, but it was like, I would read it and I just do what he was saying, pointing to awareness itself. And I don't actually even recommend that for anyone right now. I think there's more nuanced pathways, but for me, it was just like a total shift in reality, And I would say the first thing that happened is the separation between thought and awareness, recognizing that you are not the content of your thought. You are the witness of that thought. And that is a whole story that goes way deeper than what I'm saying. But just to understand that you are the witness of your thought, and you can literally sit there and you can make the thoughts say certain things. Like right now, if anyone's listening, they can say like, hi, I am thoughts, but they can say that internally and notice that they're listening, It's so odd. You're literally transfixed by an audio hallucination all your waking hours of the day, unless you start to realize and, disentangle the awareness from the thought, the subject from the object. And, they call that disidentification. We typically just assume that we are that thought. And we do the same with the nature of the body, with the nature of, self, perspective, point of view, etc. It just goes really, really deep. That was the place that was the first huge turning point for me in my well-being. And that led to a sense of peace and silence. It's like, no matter what the cacophony of the mind was, there was a sense of peace underneath. But after a couple of years of that, there still wasn't this like joyful liveliness in my body. And what's interesting is I look around now, and there's a lot of people that find that peace and just take that for the rest of their life, but they're not embodied with joy. And I feel really lucky that I wasn't satisfied with peace, This is an ironic thing to say, like, obviously wasn't extreme peace. but I knew that there was something not alive yet in my body. And that's when I started going into deeper healing work, somatic healing work, and actually seeing
Nice.
that the body, as Bessel van der Kolk says in his book, the body keeps the score. The body holds in its tensions that become unconscious. It holds all the unexpressed responses to trauma. And I had a lot of that going on, and still doing work. I'm literally here. I'm at a retreat right now as we speak. That's a somatic retreat to further disentangle trauma. And I think that's like almost a near infinite path that you can take, kind of continuously clearing the channel.
Yep.
But incredibly critical for most people. Once again, unless you had enlightened parents. So the last 7 years since that turning point has been a lot of this mix between awareness-based practice, meditative practice, spiritual practice, and emotional healing, and unwinding, like, what are all the unconscious belief systems that someone learns by growing up in a certain family, in a certain culture, from a certain ancestry, and then eventually just growing up as a human being. There's trauma in that, and that's like down the line, but that's there. And that's been just a huge turning point. Not only has chronic pain in my body shifted from doing emotional release exercises, but also remembering that you are an animal, and the civilized kind of nature that we have in our civilization is really only allowing 5 to 10% of what people are to come through. And I think as soon as someone's really honest and they sense into it, that's profoundly harmful. To not know what to do with the sensations in your body when you're all perplexed or angry, or we don't have any education for that. And one of the things that I tell people a lot about my own story is that I literally learned quantum mechanics before I learned about my emotions. No one sat down and said, here's actually, all these emotions are intelligent. That's like that's like lesson 1 in the camp program, is like literally the word emotion. The root of it is to create motion. It's to move you. It's like every other animal that's not a human being, their emotions are the only source of intelligence that guides all their actions. And look how intelligent they are. They do quite well at surviving. And then we have them and we're like, how do I distract myself from this thing? Because it doesn't feel good. Well, actually, it doesn't feel good because your life's not the way that you want it to be. And if you ignore it, you're going to stay in that situation. You're going to get, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to get stuck. And I did that a ton. I would dissociate. I would numb out, all these ways that all our culture does and kind of promotes, and I was just going food shopping yesterday and looking at the food that we offer our world and saying, man, I've had 10 years of training in actually being conscious about this stuff. How does anyone make it through our culture right now and not be extremely isolated, extremely addicted, and extremely depressed? I'm actually surprised the statistics aren't a lot worse. And I'm suspect about the statistics. I think it's horrible. Every startup company wants to look like the hockey stick of like how they're doing. That's how depression and anxiety look right now. It's actually accelerating in a runaway condition. And the estimates that I've made looking at the data is, 30, 40 years from now, if we don't make huge shifts in our culture, more than 70% of the people in the culture are going to be anxious and depressed. And we think we're going to be in any state to solve any of the big problems that we have as a culture without shifting that. To me, that's the operating system on which a human being and therefore culture runs. So there's a ton of work to be done. And so as I've come through this, just to kind of put a close on the overarching story of my life, I started to think about what would have been the biggest leverage point in my well-being. How could you, per unit time, how could you have made the biggest course correction? And I think in some sense, the globally biggest thing is like really the first 3 years of someone's life, but I don't have any expertise in that. And I have no idea how to implement a change like that.
Sure.
However, 18 to 24 is like this Goldilocks zone. You're just leaving home. And so you can actually do a lot of the emotional work. We develop these emotional repressions and defense mechanisms because of the family dynamic. We have to learn what helps us survive. And so it's really hard to work on that when someone's still at home, because at the end of the day, they go home to the source of the trauma. And if you start to open all that kind of stuff up, there can be, you learned it for a reason. It was intelligent. So 18 to 24, someone's getting on their own. they're in their own world, and they're as young as they're ever going to be, where they can still work on that. And so you haven't developed all these habit patterns for 40 years where, you know, your neural pathways are just like solid.
Yep.
So there's a lot of malleability in someone's life at that point. And there's, you know, you want to work that as young as possible. But then the other thing is they're moving into a totally different environment. So no one necessarily knows all those patterns about them. And you know, for anyone that's like gone to college on the first day, it's like you don't know anybody and you have no preconceptions yet about what they're going to be like. And so imagine you go through a summer program and you shed all of these trauma, you get to work through all the repressions and defense mechanisms, you get to really understand what deep, authentic connection with another human being is, like deeply vulnerable connection where anything you feel is welcome. And then you show up on a college campus, you know, it's, you know, I've left retreats where you just feel so wide open that there's nothing that could come at you that wouldn't be met with love.
Yeah.
And that's what I wish for other people, because if that's the stationing that people meet you as, then they're going to actually help hold you to that new identity.
Yeah.
And it is still an identity. It's still an ego personality. And I'm not trying to transcend that personality when someone's 18 to 24. It seems like the healthiest way to actually do that spiritual work later is to really station a very healthy ego structure in a young adult. And so the science is, you know, I was a mathematician and a physicist at MIT. And so the scientist in me has been looking at this whole thing as a science problem, a physics problem. And this is the first iteration. The guess is that 18 to 24 for a month, away from all devices, so you can regulate your nervous system, on the ground. You know, we're in Hawaii, we're in this beautiful retreat center in Hawaii for a month. So you have a lot of time to renegotiate how your nervous system works and get away from all the devices, and the sugar addictions and all that kind of stuff is cut out. You're going to be having a vegetarian diet, low sugar. There's 300 fruit trees on the premises. It's just like all the kind of things stacked in your favor to work on physical health, physical nutrition, emotional health, relational health, creative expression, having the mental models about how consciousness works and stress works, and all these things put together, so that in a month you've course corrected hopefully the next 80 years of your life.
That's amazing. Love that. And honestly, as you were sharing that, like even more in depth than you already knew, because obviously I can invite you to be on this podcast because of this event. Like I want our audience to hear that, because I know that there are people that would resonate with this. But just hearing what your story as well, is like, this is the intention, that like to have people or kids and young adults change at that age. It just reminded me of my stories. Like I started in terms of like consciousness and awareness, and like the term metacognition you used is something I never knew of until I was 21. But when I was 21, a mentor I'm still working with, her name is Mary Morrissey. She's in her 70s. She introduced that whole concept to me, and it blew my mind. And I really believe that, yeah, literally. And I really believe I am where I am today because it was at that early stage, 21 years old, that I got that information and started to live in a different way. And so it's just incredible. I mean, just to hear the work that you're doing. And I personally, I mean, for even just a little that you already shared on it, I would highly recommend this. And I personally wish I was at that age so that I can go through this,
this
camp
too.
with you.
Me too.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, I invented it because when I look back at myself, it would have been 15 years of depression shifted.
Right. Yeah.
And I know that that's true for so many people. It's, as you said, and you're so lucky, as you said, to be exposed to anything like metacognitive awareness when you're 21. That changes the whole game.
It does.
You just reminded me, like the malleability goes away fast in people. I remember, this is a little tangential, but I was giving talks at schools a lot around perception and consciousness, and I spoke to a bunch of third graders, and I showed the evolutionary tree, and I said, you know how you have 2 parents and 4 grandparents and 8, 16, whatever, you know, you only have to go back 30 generations before you're connected to like everybody basically on the planet, because that's like billions and billions of people connection. And I said, you know what that means? That means the person you're sitting next to is a distant cousin of yours. And these 9-year-olds looked at each other and they started screaming and hugging each other. Aww. They were just ready to accept an entirely new worldview in 5 seconds of interconnectedness.
Yeah.
And I gave the same exact slide to 13-year-olds 2 hours later at another school. And it was kind of dead silent. It was just like, oh, okay, you know. And so this this openness and this ability to actually, it just goes away fast. And so
It
there's
does.
really like, now I'm 44 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I consider myself a very open, malleable person.
Sure.
But I know that it's much harder to do things. It's much harder to like do a workout program than when I was 20 years old. If I
Right.
get injured, it heals like 10 times as slow now than when I was
Yeah.
20 years old. My jet lag lasts longer, all this stuff. So
Yep.
these are real factors in the physiology of a human being. And
Definitely.
yeah. And when I only made this because I couldn't find anything like it.
Right.
I would have like supported someone else's project or something, but
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of projects out there that do, for example, nature bound, for, rites of passage, coming of
Sure.
age, that sort of thing. And this surely is a rite of passage. And it surely will have challenges. Let me be really frank with anyone that's listening. But this is a very multidimensional program. And I haven't found anything like that. Literally, like I didn't know until about 5 years ago that I was dehydrated for most of my life, because you lose the signal after a while. It goes unconscious, like your defense patterns. And so hydration is part of the program. Learning how to cook for yourself. I didn't know how to cook for myself till I was past 30, and that's drastically changed the quality of my life. I'm a musician, and yet there's things about holding in creative expression. So there's a whole course with me and one of my best friends, who's my bandmate, teaching creative expression, shameless creative expression. Not to even mention the kind of relational and emotional intelligence, which is really the core of the program.
Definitely.
Really understanding like what it is like to be in a container where anything is allowed. That's real for you is allowed.
Right.
That unwinds so much in the groups that I've facilitated. It just is incredible. And the word I always use is permission. Kind of principle one of this whole camp is not only do you have permission, but when you act toward your resistance and when you actually step into something that's hard for you, everyone wants to go next. You permission the whole energy of the whole space. And when you make that explicit at the beginning of a month-long program, what happens is what I call a permission spiral. People start to metacognitively see that I go through this hard thing and I feel way better on the other end. And then you start to see this with a bunch of people, and it's like by day 20, I'm so excited to see, because most of the retreats I do is like 6-7 days.
Sure.
And it just starts to accelerate by then. People are like really starting to feel the depth of safety.
Yep.
But 30 days in, where's that going to go?
It sounds honestly like a lot of fun, really. Like as much as like you said, there's going to be challenge within that, but like, because I mean, after almost 10 years of my own like internal work, like it's not very often, but definitely a handful of times a year that like I have that that breakthrough moment experience, which it definitely is much easier when you're in community, like a supportive space. And I mean, I consistently like look for places I can do that for myself, but like that kind of like awareness and just experience. I mean, the real word for it is definitely experience. Like it's unlike anything else that we can experience. Like no amount of external stimulus can match that, at least in my viewpoint.
Match the internal shift you're talking about.
Yeah. And then the experience you have internally because of that, because you've actually done that hard, difficult internal work. Like you said, it's like just actually facing that, giving yourself permission. So
it's like, that's one axis of it is no external stimulus. The other one is like no intellectual understanding. Will let you know what something's going to feel like when you have a shift of consciousness itself, when literally the operating system by which you run coheres in a way that was incoherent, and these things that felt like opposing forces actually gel into intelligence that is all in your service. All of a sudden your energy goes up because you're not fighting yourself. More of your essence self, people have different words for it, but more of your essence actually starts to pour through with less and less effort. And that's a somatic and conscious based shift that you can read all the books in the world that you want, and you'll never understand what it feels like to finally release the thing that everything in your nervous system says, if I release this, someone's going to hurt me. Which is where these defense mechanisms generally come from. Like for example, if I let out anger, I'm going to get attacked, which was one that was built into my body. And the first couple of times that I had to unrepress to actually unleash that anger in a safe environment where I'm not actually going to hurt anyone, it felt like I was going to die. My nervous system literally said, this pathway leads to death. This pathway leads to attack. Do not go in this direction. I was sweating profusely. I was crying. I was like did not want to move in that direction. And then on the other end, just the sense of relief of the nervous system actually relearning, wait a second, that was true 35 years ago. It's not true anymore.
Yeah.
You can't intellectualize your way to that. It's, and I was a deep reading academic person who thought you could intellectualize your way to everything.
Yep.
But it's a whole different kind of learning.
Yeah. I would love I'm actually curious and to hear more about that. What you, about your experience going from the intellectual side, because again, you're very intellectual, to this more experiential, transformative way of living, because I'm actually very similar. So my background, I went to school to get my doctorate in pharmacy, but I did not continue and complete that 6-year program to get my doctorate, because after 4 years, I realized I didn't want to continue to go and help people in that way. Just didn't resonate with me. I saw the issue behind like that. We were treating a lot of symptoms. So I left. I got a 4-year degree, but I left. And that's when I found my mentor, 21 years old, and went on this whole path. But so literally, even to this day, sometimes I notice myself like still being an intellectual mind, trying to like intellectualize things. So you can speak on more of that, because I have a feeling that a lot of people struggle with that too.
Yeah. I can say general comments, and then there's some more like in your face kind of comments about it. The in your face. Yeah. I'll start with the in your face thing. A lot of the time, the want to intellectualize is a defense mechanism that we've learned.
Yeah.
And what you can feel if you start to sense into the felt sense of the body is that it helps you keep energy up here, because down there is really frightening. All the animal intelligence, the rage, all the fear, all that kind of stuff. If I can get really enmeshed in a problem up here, it's actually an avoidance mechanism. And I learned this, experientially. A great example. I was dating someone, and I was stuck in this question of, are they the right partner? Or are they not the right partner? Are they the right partner? I was like, I really thought I had to solve this problem. And then I did a coaching session, and the coach said, if you couldn't leave, like, what would happen? And all of a sudden I realized, like, I was really angry about something and I didn't want to tell her. And my whole, like, should I stay or go, was so I didn't have to tell her I was angry about something, because I thought it was going to hurt.
Yeah.
And, it takes a real, like, absolute honesty about yourself to start to see that stuff, because the mind is a trickster, and it will just say, no, actually I got to do this. But that's a cultural trauma that we have. Like, not everyone in their life is centered here, but with the Western world, one of their traumas is that we're disembodied. I think it's very rare that a person in the Western world really firmly has their feet, like, firmly on the ground and feels totally safe in their body. But those things happen over generations. We have secure attachment in our culture is leaving. It's actually like departing. And in the way I look at it, it's like, once it's left one generation and you get insecurely attached, like, how are you going to securely attach to your kids? It's a one-way street unless you do a lot of internal work. And so we are getting more and more up in here, and also we happen to be in a time in history where intellectualization is the main thing we're promoting for jobs and all this kind of stuff.
Yep.
But then look at the statistics, right? Whatever this culture is doing right now is not helping mental health. It's hurting mental health. It's getting worse and worse.
Yep.
So there's got to be that really, like, sober, okay, this is not helping.
Yeah.
We got to do something else. Right. And so, yeah, intellectualization, the in your face part is it's a defense mechanism. I forget what else we wanted to talk about.
I think you said there was like maybe like a more like a not as direct in your face like answer to that, or not even answer, but like, or just your experience of it. And
yeah, well, at least for me, when the ruminating really started, it was always one of the phrases I use when I work with people is beautiful intelligence. And when people have emotions come up or hard things in their mind, they tend to judge them and think that they're a problem. And there's a huge lens shift when you look at, like, how is this thing beautiful intelligence?
Wow.
And just to give one really specific example, when you're angry about something, there's always a beautiful intelligence that something is happening that's not okay for you. There's a no in your body. And when you look at someone like Gandhi and the way they live that no, it's incredibly healthy, right? He was never yelling at anybody, but he was so firm that something wasn't okay. And he trusted that beautiful intelligence. And that's the channeling of coherent anger. And if an animal doesn't have that, it's unsafe. So bam, it's just that
Yep.
simple. Anger is one of the easier ones to describe, but they
Sure.
all have that nature. They all have a beautiful intelligence inside.
Yeah.
Now, that's even true in the intellectual realm. The beautiful intelligence is that I want to be settled. I want to be coherent. I want my life to make some sense to me. And when I learn all these defense mechanisms and incoherent belief systems, I get trapped because my
Yeah.
own belief systems are incoherent.
Yep.
So even that frustration is a beautifully intelligent pointer to the desire for coherence and serenity.
Yeah.
And honestly, if someone's really clear and like honest with themselves about the beautiful intelligence, they, without coming to camp, just take this one line home and play with it for a month. And if you check every time there's something that comes up and you look for it and you start to tap into the beautiful intelligence, layers of self-judgment and shame will just not be able to have anything to stand on. It's not that you'll have to like work through them. It's just, it won't even make sense anymore, because you'll actually understand that this being is such a good-hearted thing at its core. And it just doesn't have the skillful means to get what it wants because we live in an insane place.
Right.
We literally, Russell Brand had a great quote recently. I forget how he put it, but he's like, we just like born wherever we're born. We don't realize like the level of sanity or insanity in the culture we're in. And this is a quite insane culture. Most people are not very happy when you poll them. And so this is the water we're swimming in.
Right.
So just these little tweaks of understanding, like actually everyone wants the same things. Everyone wants safety. Everyone wants connection. Everyone wants the promoting of their culture. Like these are good things. And if you really are willing to challenge yourself, you can't any longer find a bad person anymore. You can just find unskillful people that are stuck in their own trauma patterns, but still want their safety for their people. They want to be connected. And that's a very hard, depending on where someone's at in their development, that's a really contentious conversation, because we like to think there are bad people.
Right.
But there's just a lot of hurt in the world right now. And the way that I see it, we've spent thousands of years evolving better and better intellectual mechanisms to remember good and bad and what hurts. But we haven't spent almost any time developing the mechanisms to unwind those things. And so we are the most sensitive, most stressed animal that you can find. I mean, we're sensitive to things that no other animal can be sensitive to. You watch TV with any other animal and they don't have any reaction to it. But if you're watching the news, it's all this like sensitivity to being able to understand subtler and subtler aspects of the universe.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing all that. And just to reiterate and highlight the one, I love the phrase you use, beautiful intelligence. Or right? Was that exactly it? Yeah. Because I would 100% agree and just echo that, is that like there is intelligence in the emotions that are coming up, whether that they feel good or they feel quote unquote bad. But then also, like the intellectual process, like you mentioned, the frustration, how like that's actually still pointing to what needs to be worked on or to let go of, I think is more accurate to what you were saying with like the mind, is that a lot of these layers can just be sloughed off. Like we don't need them. It's actually not helpful at all. And trying to intellectualize about the intellect is just, it spins the wheel and it's like, yeah, exactly. Like there's no getting out of that, because and actually Einstein has a great quote where it says, the significant problems that we face in the world cannot be solved by the level of thinking that has created them. And I think, at least in my a viewpoint of that, is that it's also the actual thinking of it. Not just that we need a new level of thinking, but actually like a letting go of the thinking sometimes.
Yeah, and I would say that is another level of consciousness, right? I don't remember what words he used, but yeah, it's like it's not just thinking about thinking, but it's witnessing or meta consciousness of that issue.
Yes.
So sometimes these things are just like you see it and it's gone, it's sloughed off, like you said. Sometimes you see it and you're like, oh, I need to act in a certain way in my life for this to go away as a bad feeling. Like this feeling is telling me I need to change something in my life. And actually there's a great coach, Doug Tatterin, who has a whole healing process where you do all this work with him. But if that doesn't resolve it, it always means there's something you haven't done in your relationships.
Interesting.
And it won't go away because it's that intelligent and it knows it needs to change something in the relationships.
Exactly.
That Einstein quote's really, really core. because we're all so trusting in rationality, and all our
Right.
school system is 98% rationality based.
Yeah.
And I didn't have any idea that my body was intelligent. I didn't even really, if I'm honest, I didn't really have an idea that the body was a thing to pay attention to. Maybe sexually it's a thing to pay attention to get
Sure.
pleasure, but it's definitely not something where it's giving me subtle signals every single moment about what I want and don't want, and what I need, and how my relationship is going. And a lot of the way I do facilitation lately is through games.
Nice.
And so just a super simple game that anyone can try anytime is called Blip. And you just teach some of your friends this game, and then you just play it. And what's what I call a parallel game. So you do whatever you want to do, and you're playing Blip at the same time. And all Blip means is that we're talking, we're doing our thing, we're hanging out, we're eating dinner, whatever. If I feel any kind of twist of incoherence in my body, I just say Blip. I don't have to explain it. I don't have to get into discussion around it. But man, the things that will unwind, someone will say something and all of a sudden you'll feel that twist and you'll say Blip, and then you'll probably get into a discussion about it because you'll realize that what they said triggered something. Right. But you're building metacognitive awareness of your felt sense intelligence. And just by tracking that, you play with just for an evening, people start saying it, and you'll see the level of subtle intelligence that's running all the time, but totally under your notice typically, unless you've had the deep luck to be exposed to this kind of work.
Right.
Which is,
like you said,
1% of people.
Yeah. Yep. That's an awesome game. I love that. I'm going to try that out myself, because I
let me know how it goes.
Speaking of literally like the body giving intelligence, like when you were explaining that game, how simple it is, like I felt like an expansion in my heart space. I'm like, ooh, I could easily see that being very powerful.
Yeah, it's great to get that feedback, because it's like just the permission. It's another one of these metacognitive things. It's just the realization that it's okay to have a twist in myself. Right. And it's okay to share that. And the Blip is like the reason I created Blip was because I didn't want to say the really difficult thing. That's too many steps. That's too hard at the same time. Yeah. But just Blip. I can say Blip, and then the person will typically like me and they love me, so they want to know what's blipped, and then I'll talk. So it's like I'm using the physics mathematician in me to try to derive games that are the simplest, smoothest ways into people's freedom, authentic freedom. Blip is not you making anything up. It's just getting deeper in touch with what goes on, and the way that changes the social dynamic is profound. Just to contrast it with another game, because you were talking about some of the ways we get stuck in intellectualization and that sort of thing. There's a game called I Want, and I love this one as well. And it works amazing, especially for things like conflict. Like say we're in a conflict. I Want is just we're just having a conversation again. But anytime I'm finished saying what I'm saying, or you're finished saying what you're saying, I add one more sentence that describes what all of that stuff wanted. And it has to start with I want blank. Yeah. So right now at the end, I would say, I want to make sure that I explain the rules of this really clearly so that you and your listeners can participate and try it out. And when you're in conflict with someone and you're like, I was in conflict with a friend of mine, and we just decided to play this game. And the details of the conflict, not important at all, just a miscommunication. Like most conflicts, a miscommunication, and then we started getting a little tussle about it, and we played I Want for like 10 minutes, and it just unwound the whole thing. And one of the key lines was something like, I was like describing all the stuff that needed to happen in this container that I was facilitating, but then the end thing I just said, I want you to see me as good and not a danger. And it's like, there's always in fights, there's always this soft underbelly that just wants to connect and feel safe with other people. Yeah. But we're just like this, and we don't learn anything else except this. It's like, how good can you be at fighting? So that's another game that's just like, whether you're just having fun and it'll unwind really the depths of conversations about really what people are interested in, but also for conflict, it's incredibly powerful. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that too. And I'll give an example, because literally just yesterday I was in conflict with my fiance, and it was because of how I was experiencing
a feeling of not like having space because my schedule has been very full recently. But yesterday was the time for me and my fiance to connect, but I felt was so up in my head that I wasn't like being present. And I tried to like work through like what I was challenged with like my calendar and like me and my brother on our podcast. And like, there's so much things in my head. And I'm realizing now, like looking back at yesterday, if I didn't simply just said, I want a resolution to this challenge around my schedule, then I feel like the rest of that challenge between me and my fiance of like her not being able to, or knowing how to help me, like would have been dissolved pretty quickly.
Mm.
So thank you for that. Cause literally like I'm going to use this literally later today when I talk to my fiance
Amazing.
again. So thank you. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I'll tell you the one other tweak that can be important for the game is that wants are stacked on top of each other, right? You're wanting for a resolution in your schedule. What's the deeper want underneath that, for example?
I'd say the first thing that came to my mind was I want more peace.
Yeah, I want more peace. Right.
Yeah.
And so in that case, the resolution of the schedule is potentially one way to get that peace, but it's not any longer the only way. And the deeper you go into the wants, the more expanse there is. And if you're in a discussion with someone and you're stuck once again on the symptomatic level, I need a resolution of my schedule, there might not be a way. But if you disentangle what the deepest wants are, then all of a sudden there's connection possible and there's a plethora of options to turn. So if the person that you're talking with is not satisfied with the want, they can say deeper. And then that it probes you to unpack that want and what's the want underneath that want.
That's beautiful. I love that. Because that's like, thank you for sharing that, Jeff. Because that it gets to the deeper realm of things, which to me, like as much as I'm like a very intellectual person, I'm also very like deep. And I want that deeper connection. Like I really crave for that. So that right there, I think lands for me even more. Because that's exactly it. It's like the deeper sense of things. It's like, that peace and ease, but also it doesn't have to be one particular way, like you said. Like literally when you said that, I felt like that was a coaching moment. So thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Because I really felt like there was a release of that. Like, oh shit. Like that was me in my own mind of like, this is the way to solve it when it might not be.
It might not be. What's wild is I've had moments where me or the person I'm talking to will say something like, I want to know I'm safe here. And we'll just start crying and the conflict's done. Right. There's nothing that has to be solved anymore. It's just that actually the vulnerable thing is finally part of the conversation. And it's profound. When someone gets in touch with the fact that like their need to have time to get a haircut is because they need to feel self-valued, is because they need to stay in connection. And that's their belief of how they stay in connection. And it just like unpacks.
Oh yeah.
Then they're in a really sensitive, vulnerable place. And conflict doesn't exist in a sensitive, vulnerable place in the same way. You know, when your amygdala gets triggered, you go into black and white thinking. That's like a very useful, once again, beautiful intelligence, because your amygdala never used to get fired by your partner. You used to get fired by a predator that was chasing you, and you shouldn't be learning new things about yourself when you're getting chased. You should be very concerned about the death threat. So now we have the same alert go off when your partner says something a little cheeky to you, you know, it's the same alarms. And so to be able to like have mechanisms that feel that fire come online and what's going on under here and just getting in touch with it. It's such a game changer.
Definitely. Yeah, it's incredible. And I would love to tie this back to obviously like your camp, like, because tell us a bit more of like because obviously, I mean, I feel like literally just what we went through in the last 10, 15 minutes is a part of like, I mean, I know it's a part of like what you're delivering at your camp, but anything else you want to share about that or anything else like in terms of what you cover? Cause like this is already a beautiful example, but to give people even more experience of like what that would be like for them.
Yeah, I'm glad to. Thank you for asking. Like, as I said, the more I looked at the facets of my life, the more I realized there were incoherences or imbalances in all of the facets. And so we're starting with physical health and nutrition. And you'll be learning how to cook. You'll be learning how to make meals properly for your mixed, whole body's needs. You'll be learning about hydration. You'll be doing physical exercise and yoga every day.
Nice.
That's packet one. Second one is self-awareness. So metacognition, meditation, learning about your relationship with your mind, specifically starting with the fact that you are not your thoughts and just taking off from there. There's plenty of ways to develop a deeper sense of metacognitive relationship to your mind. Embodiment is a huge field where you realize that you're not just your head and you're not just your rational intelligence, and there's an incredible amount of intelligence and joy and pleasure to be found in the body if it's listened to. So we'll be doing movement practices, and some of the yoga will be oriented towards that as well. But that's also woven in to the next bin, which is the emotional and relational intelligence. And you need that tool of feeling into your body in order to deepen your relationships with other people and your relationship with yourself and your coherence within yourself. So emotional and relational intelligence is kind of like the overarching thing where no matter what we're doing, we're all cooking together, we're going to be also doing relational intelligence games.
Nice.
That sort of thing. The creative expression track I talked about earlier, which is all about the unique voice that all of us have. And the more that you actually allow it to evolve, the more unique it gets, which means the more and more challenge you have about releasing it in front of an audience, in front of a culture, because that culture, we're herd animals, we're social mammals. We rejection, I think it's really important for people to remember, if they don't end up going to the camp, remember that we come from a place not long ago that rejection meant death.
Yep.
Didn't mean like, I'm going to feel bad at the end of the day. It meant death. You needed the tribe. And really getting in touch with the depth of that, and then being able to lean into it and realize, oh, wait a second, like it's not the same anymore. And actually, if there's 50 people here and 40 of them hate what I do, that's great. And that doesn't mean any boundary on my actual being myself. So that's a really important track. And then the last track is mental maps, I call it. We don't have any map. I was never given any map of the dimensions of the human experience. What's going on right now? There's thought and there's senses in your body, and those are clearly two different forms of intelligence. How are they related? What other things are there? Well, metacognition is not thought in the same way that rational thought is. And as far as I've made the map, just like Roy G. Biv is not all the colors, but it's useful to have a map of 7 colors. So I've made a map that lets people understand pretty quickly and simply, what are these 7 different dimensions of intelligence that we have? Where did they come from in evolution? And then what gets stuck with them? So that when something gets stuck, you can really quickly identify, oh, you know what, like this is me shutting down. What does that mean? Oh, it means I'm afraid to feel fully the thing that's under this shutdown. So how do I find an environment that lets that come out safely? So I can I have a tool set and an overarching look at how the human experience works, how stress works in the body. And man, do I wish I had had one of those when I was 20, instead of just someone to talk to, which is kind of how most of this is. And that's already so useful.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of 6 or 7 main tracks, you could say, of education or enjoyment at the camp.
Nice. That's beautiful. Yeah. And again, full 30 days, right? It's full month.
30 days. Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah. It's pretty immersive, pretty unique experience. Excited to really feel, and I already know that myself and the counselors are going to be getting so much out of that experience too. It's leaning into a level of facilitation that none of us have had a chance to do as well.
Right. Yeah.
And the kind of way I work with games and with experiments is that we'll be creating iteration 2 as we run iteration 1, taking notes, seeing what works and what doesn't work. And just like any good facilitator does. But when I'm really think out to it, we're trying to start doing work with institutions like places like UCSF, and try to put some data research together so we can actually track and confirm, yes, this has long-term integrated shifts in people's well-being.
Nice.
Because as soon as you can prove that with data, then my goal would be that you start to have the flows that go to universities. The schools themselves make a track and say, oh, the summer before you come to school, 10% of the class comes to this. And then you have a cultural shift of inertia, where imagine 10% of the class knew all of these things. Then you're like inevitably you're going to be friends with some of those people, and then all of a sudden you have cultural permeation of these norms, which are not the norm in most places. That's my longer vision for how this expands.
I could totally see that. And again, for people listening, I know that there are, because again, it's 18 to 24, correct? The age to go into this camp. But I also, I've talked with many people, that listen to our podcast, but also some of my colleagues, my friends that are older, that have very similar visions, but are not doing anything about it up until now, maybe. But like, I love this, that you have this offering. And also I feel honored that I can support you in this and sharing this, because again, same as you, that you wish you had this when you were 20. I wish I would have had this as well. It's incredible. Sounds awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate the support. And I will say, for other people that are interested in this kind of work, I intend on making this an open source project that is really collaborative, working with universities, working with other people. I'm not going to make up all the best practices for this kind of stuff. And there's probably going to need to be local shifts for all those practices for people of different sorts. So that's really the deep vision, is that this is just needed. This is just needed. Like, I can't think of something that's higher leverage right now. And if someone tells me something that's higher leverage, I'll probably go do that.
Right.
That's the way that the scientist in me works. I really just want to do the thing that's actually the most worth doing here.
Exactly.
Because when you tune into the actual amount of suffering that's happening right now, it will bowl you over. It's incredible. And, I think it takes practice to even let your brain know how to tune into that kind of suffering. Those are deep compassion practices, which we'll do at camp as well. But the problem is so large. The suffering that I felt was so large. And there's 100 million people in the United States that are having that kind of depression, anxiety. So yeah, it's unfathomable. And so anyone interested in this kind of work, I would love to hear from them, and also hear what other people are trying to do to work on it.
Right. Yeah. So where tell us about the application process, going through that. Because we'll have the link in the description of this episode, but yeah, if you can explain that, just so someone can get an easy idea of what's next.
Yeah. So we Sleep Awake is the name of the camp. Sleep, like a pun on Sleep Awake Camp. Yeah. But it's awake, so don't type it wrong. And there's an apply page there. And the way that typically works is that if someone's interested, they'll set up a 30-minute call just to meet us and just to feel each other out and have any questions they might have. The site has like 30 minutes of us talking about it, and really a lot of information, but nothing substitutes meeting us in person.
Right.
And then the application is a pretty intensive, it's like a 1 or 2 hour process. And we wrote the application such that it in itself is a form of transformative process. So it exposes you to really what is working in my life? What are the challenges in my life? Where do those things fit in, and how would I work on them? And so hopefully it just gives you on its own a slight bit of transformation, just to explore the nature of yourself. When they submit that, we have a follow-up interview. And the main reason we do a follow-up interview is there are people with lots of different needs, and we need to make sure that their needs are tuned with what we can offer. There are people, if someone has like a really deep personality disorder, that's something that I hope in later years we would have structures for, but it's definitely not the structures we have set up right now.
Sure.
But depression and anxiety, I know that well. I know that world well. And I feel really thankful to know ways through it and see how little of those are being implemented. So that the interview would be a chance for us to really get to know each other, to sense into, as I said, a lot of this structure will be game oriented and really like playing games with each other. And so making sure that someone's interested in that and get to play some games. We've had a couple interviews, and just, it's so fun to get to play a game with someone, like the I Want game or the Blip game. And then after that, that's it. And the only other thing, we have a sliding scale. It's quite extreme. It's from $500 to $5,000. So if you have a wealthy family, then we would love for people to pay full price. But we've had a lot of really generous donors that have given us money for the mission, and we can really cut costs for people that need that are really well tuned for the program.
Nice. That's awesome. I'm thrilled to hear that too, because this is so needed, like you said. And yeah, to not have that financial aspect be a barrier. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it's really critical. And I feel I just want to really explicitly thank all of those donors, because I knew that at least for the first year, this was not a profitable business. And it has this relaxes it. So we don't have to orient at all towards profit. We can really orient towards roughly breaking even with some of the donorships and doing a proof that actually shows, okay, this is a real thing. And now we can get a bigger vision going.
Nice. Yeah. That's awesome. And this is just the beginning. I can really see that, again, I can't imagine that this wouldn't be a success as the years go on, because it's so needed. And not only that, it's also that like it's wanted. I think there are a lot of people that are, again, just by means of even our statistics on this podcast, is that there's so many younger people searching for this type of information. And so it's just awesome to hear. I mean, just that you have this as a space for people to come to. So yeah, thank you for sharing.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. If you're the 1 in a million young adult who learned all this stuff, then don't apply.
Yeah.
You know,
right.
But for the rest of us, there's Sleepawake Camp.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, beautiful. And like I said, we'll include that link in the description. So if you're listening and if this has been calling your name, click the link. You can go through that whole website, check it out, like Jeff said, and then there's the application process to dive in.
Yeah, and it's rolling admissions, so apply as soon as possible, because as soon as the slots get filled, it's and there's only 16 slots for this year. It's a very small pilot program.
Nice. Excellent.
Yeah.
Awesome, Jeff. Well, thank you so much for being here and sharing, I mean, just all your brilliance and just your experience, as well as this work that you're putting together. And so it's been awesome having this conversation with you.
Thank you. It's been super fun to talk, and I deeply appreciate your support of the mission of it.
You're welcome. Yeah. Hopefully we'll have you back on the podcast sometime soon for something else.
That sounds great.
Awesome. All right, Jeff. Good talking with you. And that's it for today. So thanks for tuning in. We really hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed recording it. So any questions, any comments, connect with us on Instagram personally at Kevin F. Carton
or at Chris J. Carton, or our podcast Instagram page at Science and Spirituality Podcast. And if you feel guided to, the one thing that we do ask is for you to please rate the podcast and also leave a review. This way we can reach more people and in that way impact more lives. So with that, we'll see you on the next episode.